Evening fell over Manila like a grey shroud. Fine raindrops punished the asphalt, transforming the city into a labyrinth of murky reflections and hidden horizons. The silence of the storm muffled urban noises, as if nature itself wanted to create a moment of pause in the frantic bustle of the metropolis. At the corner near the cathedral, under the dim light of a lamppost struggling against growing shadows, lay a small mound of worn blankets. An inattentive glance might confuse it with discarded trash, with remains no one would claim. But truth breathed beneath those rags. Tired eyes of 80 years observed the world through a gap between the soaked cloths. Dona Rosa, a former primary school teacher, now just another statistic on Manila's streets, counted her last coins while hunger gnawed at her stomach like a wild animal. 3 days without a complete meal. 3 days since she was evicted after her grandson sold the house to pay gambling debts. The wrinkled hands that once taught hundreds of children to write their first names now trembled not only from cold but from fear of the approaching night. The city she had served for decades passed by her as if she were invisible, as if old age were a contagious disease that no one dared to look at directly. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle walked hurriedly after a long meeting at the Episcopal Conference. His black umbrella swayed against the wind while his thoughts wandered between the administrative concerns of the church and the homily he needed to prepare for Sunday. That's when his steps faltered. Something, or someone, captured his peripheral vision. Something that shouldn't be there, exposed to the merciless rain. It wasn't a conscious decision that made Cardinal Tagle change his route. It was a primitive impulse, prior to words, prior to reason. The kind of movement that comes from the deepest layers of the soul. His feet carried him to the small mound of blankets, while his mind still tried to process what was happening. The smell came first, a mixture of mildew, old sweat, and despair. Then the sounds, a fragile and irregular breathing, like the whisper of dry leaves in the wind. Finally, when he bent down, protecting the small space with his umbrella, he saw the eyes. Eyes that had seen so much, now clouded by cataracts and abandonment. A weak cough shook Dona Rosa's small body. Her cracked lips tried to form words, but only a moan escaped. The cardinal felt something break inside him. It wasn't just compassion, it was indignation. How could a society that called itself civilized allow an elderly woman to end her days like this, thrown away like an object without utility? The sirens of passing cars, the conversations of hurried passers-by, everything now seemed distant and unreal. The cardinal's world had been reduced to that small perimeter where 2 human beings lay, one clothed in purple and authority, the other covered only by dusty rags. The rain created a curtain around them, as if nature wanted to give them a moment of privacy. Cardinal Tagle didn't think about consequences, protocols, or what people would say. With a gentle movement, he touched Dona Rosa's shoulder and realized she was trembling. There weren't enough words to fill that abyss of injustice, so he said nothing. He simply extended his hand, offering not just help, but recognition, the simple and revolutionary act of seeing another human being completely. The crowd began to form at a distance, curious gazes trying to understand why the cardinal was kneeling on the wet sidewalk. Cell phone cameras discreetly captured the unusual scene. The religious leader, however, remained oblivious to all this, focused only on the elderly woman whose knotty fingers now held his like an anchor in the storm. Dona Rosa had been someone. The faded and crumpled photographs she kept in a plastic bag told the story of a full life. A smiling young woman in front of a rural school, children around her, a simple wedding with a man in military uniform, a baby in her arms while waving to the camera. Fragments of happiness preserved on paper, while the reality around her fell apart. The cardinal removed his coat and covered the fragile shoulders of the elderly woman. The thin but dry fabric seemed ridiculously inadequate given her needs, but it was what he could offer at that moment. And then, in a gesture that would soon be captured by dozens of cameras and shared thousands of times, He did something unexpected. He removed his shoes, relatively new and dry, and offered them to the woman whose feet were stuffed into torn sandals. A murmur ran through the small crowd that was now forming. The cardinal, barefoot on the wet sidewalk, ignored the stares. His focus was only on the woman in front of him, on the dignity that needed to be restored before anything else. It wasn't charity he was offering. It was justice. It was the recognition that Dona Rosa deserved more than occasional crumbs of compassion. The rain continued to fall, impartial, on the barefoot cardinal and the abandoned elderly woman. Now, however, she was no longer alone under the downpour. The silent presence of the clergyman created an island of humanity amid urban indifference, a visual reminder that the real divisions are not between rich and poor, young and old, but between those who stop to see and those who choose to move on. Minutes turned into an hour, and Cardinal Tagle remained seated on the sidewalk, beside Dona Rosa. His assistants, located by hurried phone calls, arrived agitated, trying to understand what was happening. They found their superior talking quietly with the elderly woman, while his bare feet rested in a puddle of water. What the assistants did not understand, and what the cameras could not capture, was the silent transformation occurring in that small space. The cardinal was not just listening to Dona Rosa's fragmented story. He was witnessing her humanity. Each wrinkle on her face told a story of struggle. Each scar on her hands narrated a chapter of work. The invisible woman of the streets was slowly coming back into existence through the simple act of being seen. An ambulance was called, but the cardinal refused to let them take Dona Rosa alone. With a firm gesture, he dismissed his agenda for the day. Meetings with ambassadors, interviews with international journalists, everything was postponed. His advisors exchanged concerned looks, but no one dared to question. There was something in the quiet determination of his gaze that silenced any objection. While they waited, the cardinal did something even more surprising. He took a small comb from his pocket and, with delicate gestures, began to untangle the white and tangled hair of the elderly woman. It wasn't a calculated gesture for the cameras. Many of those present couldn't even see what was happening. It was simply the natural expression of someone who recognized the wounded dignity before him and sought to restore it through the simplest and most direct means. The cardinal's hands, accustomed to holding sacred chalices and blessing multitudes, now performed the most fundamental liturgy of all: care for the broken body of a human being. There was nothing theatrical in his movements, just the quiet concentration of someone performing important work. For the few who could see up close, the scene evoked ancient images of another man, 2,000 years ago, washing dusty feet. The news began to spread like wildfire, first on local social networks, then on national news portals. Cardinal finds abandoned elderly woman and cancels agenda to personally care for her, the headlines announced. The images of the religious leader barefoot, sitting on the wet sidewalk next to the disheveled elderly woman, touched something deep in the collective imagination of a society accustomed to seeing distant authorities, protected by isolation cordons and prefabricated speeches. In the hospital, the contrast was evident. On one side, an elderly and poor woman, with borrowed clothes and no documents. On the other, one of the most powerful men of the Catholic Church in the Philippines. However, Cardinal Tagle insisted on being treated as a common companion, refusing privileges and remaining in the same waiting room where anxious families awaited news of their loved ones. The doctors diagnosed severe malnutrition, initial pneumonia, and various untreated chronic problems. The prognosis wasn't good, but neither was it terminal. With proper care, Dona Rosa could recover, at least physically. The emotional wounds of abandonment would require a more prolonged and complex treatment. While the elderly woman received the first care, the cardinal made phone calls, not to his concerned advisors or to journalists who bombarded his team with interview requests. He called shelters, nursing homes, social programs. The answer was always the same: "We have no vacancies. There is a waiting list, maybe next month." The bureaucratic reality of social assistance revealed itself as a wall of impossibilities in the face of the immediate need of a single human life. It was then that Cardinal Tagle made a decision that, the next day, would headline news across the country. Using his personal phone, he recorded a short video in the hospital corridor. In it, without elaborate rhetoric or dramatic appeals, he simply told Dona Rosa's story and announced that the Episcopal residence, adjacent to the cathedral, would open its doors to her and to other elderly people in similar situations. "If there is no place for them in our shelters," he said firmly, "then there must be room in our homes. Starting with mine." The Episcopal residence, traditionally a space for ecclesiastical meetings and formal receptions, was transformed in a few days. The ground floor guest room, previously reserved for visiting bishops and dignitaries, was adapted to receive Dona Rosa. Heavy curtains gave way to light fabrics that allowed generous entry of sunlight. A small bell was placed beside the bed so she could call when she needed help. The arrival of the elderly woman at the residence was not accompanied by ceremonies or announcements. The Cardinal had expressly requested that the press not be informed of that moment. Only a few staff members and volunteers witnessed when Dona Rosa, still fragile but visibly better after the hospital stay, crossed the threshold in a wheelchair, her few belongings stored in a simple bag. In the days that followed, something unusual happened. The Episcopal residence phone wouldn't stop ringing. They were ordinary people offering help. Retired doctors wanting to give free consultations, hairdressers offering services, families wanting to donate clothes, food, time. The story of that abandoned elderly woman, and the Cardinal who had welcomed her, had touched some forgotten chord in the collective heart of the city. The most surprising, however, was the effect on the Episcopal residence environment itself. The staff, initially apprehensive about the change in routine, began to show special care for the new resident. The cook separated the ripest fruits for her. The gardener picked fresh flowers for her room. The security guard at the entrance always had a kind word when the elderly woman ventured, with uncertain steps, through the garden. Cardinal Tagle maintained his routine of ecclesiastical commitments, but now included regular moments with Dona Rosa. They weren't formal visits or laden with ceremony. They were simple encounters, during which he sometimes read to her, other times simply sat beside her in shared silence. For the staff who observed discreetly, it was as if both had found something precious in each other. She, a place of belonging. He, a living reminder of the mission that transcended titles and ceremonies. 3 weeks after Dona Rosa's arrival at the Episcopal residence, a young reporter from the local newspaper got authorization for an exclusive interview with the elderly woman. The press had extensively speculated about her story, creating dramatic narratives about her past. It was time to let her tell her own truth, in her own words. What no one expected was the revelation that would come from that meeting. With a trembling but determined voice, Dona Rosa told not only the story of her recent abandonment, but also her past as a teacher in a small school on the outskirts of Manila. Among her students, decades ago, was a quiet and studious boy, son of a fisherman and a washerwoman. A boy who always stayed after class to help clean the blackboard and ask questions about the books she lent him. The reporter, realizing the direction of the story, almost dropped her recorder. "Are you saying that?" she questioned, unable to complete the sentence. Dona Rosa just smiled, that serene smile of the very elderly, who have seen enough not to be surprised by life's ironies. Yes, she confirmed, that curious and gentle boy who always brought a fruit for his teacher was the same man who now, dressed in cardinal purple, had rescued her from the streets. The most extraordinary thing, however, was that the cardinal himself didn't remember. Or, if he remembered, he had never made the connection between his former primary school teacher and the abandoned elderly woman he had found in the rain. When confronted by the reporter after the interview, his face reflected first confusion, then shock, and finally an emotion so deep that he needed to sit down. Memories long buried under decades of theological studies and ecclesiastical responsibilities emerged to the surface. The smell of chalk, the patient voice explaining fractions, a gentle hand adjusting his crooked glasses. The news exploded on social networks and in media vehicles. The perfect circle of compassion, one columnist called it. Life lesson in real time, another newspaper headlined. Hundreds of Dona Rosa's former students began to manifest, sharing memories, old photographs, stories of how that dedicated teacher had impacted their lives. The Cardinal's small act of kindness had inadvertently exposed an invisible web of human connections that spanned decades and transcended social barriers. On the morning of a particularly clear Sunday, 6 months after the rainy encounter, Cardinal Tagle conducted a special ceremony in the gardens of the episcopal residence. It wasn't a formal mass or a traditional liturgical celebration. It was the inauguration of Casa Rosa, the first of a network of homes for abandoned elderly, funded by donations that had come from all corners of the country and even from abroad. Dona Rosa, now recovered and wearing a simple but elegant dress, cut the symbolic ribbon at the entrance of the new facility. Her hands still trembled, but now it was from emotion, not from cold or fear. Beside her, 20 other elderly people rescued from the streets in recent months waited to see what would be their new home. Some cried silently, others smiled with eyes that had almost forgotten what it was like to have hope. The Cardinal's speech was brief, almost a whisper, as if speaking not to the cameras or to the gathered crowd, but directly to the heart of each person present. He spoke not about charity or good deeds, but about invisible debts, about how we all owe our existence to the care of others, about how a society that abandons its elderly cuts the roots of its own humanity. What we call compassion, he said, is just recognition, the simple act of seeing in the other our own face reflected. As he spoke, something unusual was happening through the streets of the city. Inspired by the story that had dominated the news for months, ordinary citizens were performing small acts of human connection. Families visited previously ignored elderly neighbors. Young people offered help to strangers in difficulty. Communities organized efforts to improve living conditions in neglected areas. Like a stone thrown into a lake, the encounter between the Cardinal and the abandoned teacher generated waves that expanded in ever-widening circles. In the small chapel of Casa Rosa, now transformed into a reading and living room, an old photograph was prominently displayed. A young teacher surrounded by smiling children, among them a boy with glasses too big for his thin face. Below the image, a simple inscription: "We never know what seeds we plant, or when they will bloom. Just plant." Evening fell over Manila like a golden mantle. Cardinal Tagle and Dona Rosa sat on a simple bench in the garden, watching birds competing for breadcrumbs. They didn't exchange words. They didn't need to. Between them now flowed the silent language of those who recognize, in the face of the other, the reflection of the same light. The city continued its rhythm around them, transformed not by decrees or great revolutions, but by the rediscovery of the simplest and most easily forgotten truth: that no life is invisible when we truly look at each other. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.